And we're now going to move on quite quickly because we've got a number of speakers to Ashley South, who is going to join us by Skype, and you'll see him on the screen there. And Ashley, in just a minute, I'm going to unmute my microphone so that you can, or mute it so that you can then speak. But I just wanted to say that we're going to give each of our speakers about 10 minutes, and at the end of this session, we're hoping to have at least 30 to 40 minutes where we have an open discussion with the audience, both in the room as well as online. So we'll be looking forward to your comments and questions for the panel to respond to. After the meeting, we're going to have about 30 minutes or so where we've got a sandwich, lunch, and some refreshments, so you can feel free to discuss with the panelists as well as amongst yourselves, so a bit of a networking opportunity. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ashley. Ashley is the author of the 2 Myanmar studies, and he's an independent analyst and consultant specializing in humanitarian and political issues in Myanmar and Southeast Asia. So Ashley, please, go ahead.
Thank you, Wendy, and good morning, everyone, or good evening, as I should say, here in Bangkok. I'm going to present 2 case studies from Burma or Myanmar. There are some common themes running through the studies, but these are rather different contexts also. The first study looks at the realities and activities of ethnic Karen communities living in armed conflict-affected parts of Southeast Burma. International organisations have very limited access to these armed conflict-affected areas for security reasons and because of government restrictions. In this context, a small number of community-based organisations provide short-term assistance to IDPs and other vulnerable people, primarily consisting of food and medicines. This assistance is targeted impartially, according to needs, but these CBOs are more or less closely associated with armed ethnic opposition groups. Now, there's no question about aid being diverted. Monitoring of these cross-border aid operations is very tight. But by working with these local organisations, this does raise issues regarding the manner in which foreign assistance supports and can legitimise parties to armed conflict. And I think this is one dilemma that comes up again and again at the heart of discussions about how to engage with local actors, particularly in conflict-affected countries. So I'm flagging that up as one of the key issues here. It's something that's currently playing out in Myanmar, in the north of the country, in conflict-affected Kachin state, where some people will know that armed conflict has re-emerged in the last few months. This issue, I think, introduces the question of what is protection, who gets to define this concept, and who is the legitimate protection actor. Armed non-state groups in southeast Burma, such as the Karen National Union, KNU, and other armed Karen factions, regard themselves as protectors of the ethnic Karen nation. So here we have a very different concept of protection, one which is very strongly held by many local actors, but is quite different to protection as understood in international human rights and humanitarian law. One of the tactics which armed non-state groups in the southeast of Burma use is landmines. So they are using landmines to protect territory and in some cases to protect civilians, which obviously raises interesting dilemmas and issues. Villagers themselves also sometimes use landmines to protect against incursions by the Burma army, which is seen as a predatory force, which often does indeed violate villagers' rights. So we have again an interesting dilemma of villagers using landmines, which are themselves obviously a key factor in risk, but they're using the landmines as a protective device. This is just one of a number of ways, of course, that affected families and communities in this context of armed conflict-affected Southeast Burma seek to protect themselves. The report goes into details and gives many other examples. I think one of the main themes that comes through is the key role of local leaders. These are often religious leaders, Christian pastors, Buddhist monks, who are in many cases able to negotiate with local power holders, be they armed non-state groups or Myanmar army officers. And they're able to negotiate with local power holders in order to achieve local protective outcomes for civilian populations. And I think this kind of behind-the-scenes persuasive advocacy is very important in all of the case studies that we're going to be discussing this morning. The Karen study introduces a typology of coping and survival mechanisms. Some of the key ways in which Karen villagers protect themselves and their communities is by sharing food, sharing information, and by forming alliances, as previously mentioned, with local power holders, including sometimes, for example, by providing sons to armed groups. If a family has a son in one of the armed groups, generally that means that they are less likely to be called on for forced labour. They're less likely to be demanded arbitrary taxes. So there's obviously here a very difficult trade-off for families between the well-being of an individual and the security of the family. I'm going to move on because I know we have a lot of presentations this morning to look at the second case study. This explores the realities and perceptions of people living in parts of southeast Myanmar which were affected by Cyclone Ngos, which struck Myanmar in May 2008. Many people will know that more than 150,000 people were killed in this natural disaster. Millions of people were displaced and otherwise affected. In the first month after Cyclone Ngos, the Myanmar government restricted access to affected communities for international organisations. Obviously, this was deplorable. The report comments on some of the international advocacy which at the time and afterwards centred on the government's responsibilities. And actually in the report we suggest that whilst very understandable in many ways, some of this advocacy may actually have been quite unhelpful and counterproductive. And we raise questions here about the roles of sometimes quite ill-informed, sometimes politically driven outsiders in the realm of public advocacy and whether their activities do always have the protected outcomes which are intended. Government restrictions after Cyclone Ngos did have one major benefit. In the absence of the international aid agencies one would normally expect to see in such a post-disaster context, Myanmar civil society groups responded in ways that might otherwise have been marginalised by the aid machine. I'm talking now about national NGOs, some of which were already on the ground in the Delta before the cyclone struck. CBOs, including again faith-based organisations and networks, but also just regular Myanmar citizens from Yangon and elsewhere who collected funds together, purchased water and other supplies, loaded them onto trucks, drove them down to the Delta. Members of the business community who set up food tents in affected communities. So there was excuse me, a huge local response that I think was very positive and demonstrated the huge capacity of civil society in this context, despite the difficulties of many decades of authoritarian rule in Myanmar. As with the Karen case study, though, the heart of the Delta report is focusing on how affected communities themselves took the lead in helping themselves and their fellow villagers, both in the immediate aftermath of Cyclone Ngos, when, as with the Karen study, the key roles of local leaders is emphasised, but also in the recovery and rehabilitation efforts in the months after Cyclone Ngos. Some of the local priorities and realities reported by our informants were sometimes quite different to those of international aid agencies and even to some of the NGOs from Yangon operating beyond the Delta. The report comments on some of these differences in perceptions and values, particularly in relation to communities' understanding of aid targeting, wealth ranking issues, and how these sometimes were in conflict with local values and realities. I think another thing that we tried to do in the Delta study, and I know this will come up in other presentations today, is that when we start to look for local voice, of course, it's not that simple. There are many different interests and identities at the village level. And when talking about aid targeting, clearly elites within villages, people who had previously at least been landowners, had different understandings of appropriate targeting to perhaps the poorest of the poor. In both case studies, as Niels indicated earlier, informants generally made very little distinction between rights-based concepts of perception, and broader livelihoods issues. And I know that's something that's going to come up in the other presentations. And also, just to finish off, one of the other themes that emerges again and again is that, as Neil's mentioned, that the kind of ingenious, often brave coping and survival strategies described in our case studies are in no way a substitute for implementation and respect for international human rights and humanitarian law, but also that the coping and survival strategies adopted by vulnerable populations often expose them to further risks. So, for example, in both of the Burma-Myanmar case studies, one of the ways in which families seek to secure livelihoods is by sending one or more members to be migrant workers, either within Myanmar or perhaps across the border in Thailand. This is a risky strategy because, as we know, particularly for younger people perhaps and women, that engaging in that kind of migrant labour activity exposes them to new risks. We have stories of farmers going into fields which they had good knowledge to believe may be infested with landmines because they were balancing those immediate risks against the need to feed their families. So some of these coping strategies are indeed quite counterproductive. So I'm going to wrap up now with the two Burma/Myanmar studies and wish you again a good morning and hand back to London.
Ashley, thank you very much for that excellent presentation. I think you've highlighted some really important issues that I know the other speakers that are going to come are also going to refer to. You know, who are legitimate protection actors, the enormity or the scale of local response in some situations, how local realities and values often conflict with those of international actors, and the double-edged sword of persuasive advocacy, that it can be counterproductive in some situations.